The year was 1932. Bradford, Pennsylvania, sat in the Allegheny Mountains like a wound that hadn't healed. The air carried two smells: unrefined crude oil from the derricks that still stood on the hillsides, and something harder to name: the smell of a town that had watched its future disappear. This wasn't a metropolis, it was an industrial outpost, the kind of place where men drilled deep into the earth and pulled out fortunes until they didn't anymore. By 1932, most of those fortunes were gone. I'm Jonathan Reed. I spend my time studying the physical spaces where American industry happened, the factories, the foundries, the buildings where ordinary objects were made by the millions. And sometimes I find stories that tell us something about what we built, what we valued, and what we eventually threw away. If you're interested in that kind of history, the kind that focuses on the places and the objects rather than the mythology, consider subscribing. I try to keep these examinations grounded in what actually happened. Bradford in 1932 was a town barely holding on. The oil boom that had made millionaires out of roughnecks had dried up years before. What remained were rusting derricks, unpaid mortgages, and a population that understood scarcity in a way most Americans were just beginning to learn. The Great Depression wasn't an abstract economic concept in Bradford. It was the bank on Main Street with its doors chained shut. It was the family down the street that stopped lighting their evening lamps to save kerosene. It was men in frayed suits pretending they still had prospects. The town had seen better days, much better days. In the 1870s and 80s, Bradford had been one of the richest towns per capita in the entire United States. Oil had been discovered in the surrounding hills in quantities that seemed inexhaustible. Overnight, farmers became millionaires. Wooden derricks sprouted across the landscape like a mechanical forest. The sound of drilling echoed day and night. At its peak, Bradford produced more oil than any other location in America. The streets were paved with wooden planks because the ground was so saturated with crude that nothing else would hold. Men walked around with oil-stained boots and pockets full of cash. Mansions were built, opera houses, banks that handled transactions rivaling those in New York. But oil fields deplete. The easy reserves were exhausted by the early 1900s. Production declined year by year. The millionaires moved away. The mansions fell into disrepair. By 1932, Bradford was a ghost of its former self, clinging to the remnants of an industry that had moved on to Texas and Oklahoma. The people who remained were the ones who had nowhere else to go. They were the workers, the shopkeepers, the families whose roots went too deep to pull up even when the soil had turned barren. In this environment, on a summer evening at the Bradford Country Club, a man named George G. Blaisdell stood on the terrace watching a friend struggle with a lighter. The country club itself was a peculiar institution in a town like Bradford. It maintained the rituals of affluence while the money that funded those rituals evaporated. The dances continued, the drinks were poured, but everyone knew they were performing a kind of theater. The building sat on a hill overlooking what remained of the town. From the terrace, you could see the rusting derricks scattered across the landscape like tombstones. On a clear evening, you could watch the sun set behind them, turning the metal framework into black silhouettes against an orange sky. The members were men who had once been wealthy, or who pretended they still were, or who clung to membership as proof that they hadn't completely failed. They gathered for tennis matches nobody watched, for dinners nobody could really afford, for conversations that carefully avoided the topic of money.
Blaisdell had already failed once. He'd invested in oil at exactly the wrong time, buying leases just as the production curves were turning downward. He'd lost most of what he had. He was looking for something else, some other direction, some way to rebuild. And on that terrace, he watched his friend pull out an Austrian-made lighter to light a cigarette. The device was clumsy, heavy brass, manufactured somewhere in Vienna or Salzburg. To operate it, you had to remove a cap, hold the body with one hand, and strike the flint wheel with the other. It required both hands. It required stopping whatever else you were doing. And the cap, once removed, was easily lost. Blaisdell watched this awkward performance with a critical eye. The man fumbled with the cap, nearly dropped it, managed to produce a flame, and then had to set down his drink to reassemble the device. Blaisdell asked his friend, apparently with some sarcasm, why he was using such a terrible device. The friend's response was simple: "It works." That answer struck Blaisdell as significant. In a world where banks were failing, where businesses were closing, where the promise of American prosperity had revealed itself to be fragile, the only thing that mattered was function. The Austrian lighter was ugly, yes, inconvenient, certainly, but it had one quality that saved it. It produced flame even when the wind was blowing. And on that terrace, the wind was always blowing. Bradford sat at an elevation where the air moved constantly, sweeping down from the mountains and across the hills. Every other lighter on the market would sputter and die in that wind, but the Austrian device kept burning. The secret was in the design. The Austrians had developed a perforated metal chimney that surrounded the wick. This chimney disrupted airflow and created a zone of low pressure. The flame stayed lit even in a strong breeze. The engineering was sound, but the execution was a disaster. Blaisdell understood something in that moment. The technology was correct, but the interface was wrong. A lighter that required two hands was incompatible with American life. A man needed one hand free to hold a tool, to open a door, to shake hands, to hold a weapon if it came to that. The Austrian engineers had solved the technical problem of wind, but they had ignored the human problem of use. Blaisdell saw an opportunity. He acquired the American distribution rights to the Austrian lighter. The rights were cheap because nobody else wanted them. He brought a shipment to Bradford and tried to sell them. He couldn't. They were too awkward, too foreign, too expensive for what they delivered. Most men would have written off the loss and moved on. Blaisdell didn't. He retreated to a small workshop above a garage on Bolivar Street in Bradford. The space was nothing impressive, a single room with a workbench, some hand tools, and a window that let in northern light. He had no grand factory, no team of engineers, just himself and an idea. What Blaisdell did in that workshop was not invention in the pure sense. He didn't invent the windproof chimney. He didn't invent the concept of a portable lighter. What he did was subtler and in some ways more important. He redesigned the housing. He took apart the Austrian lighter and examined every component. The chimney was brilliant. The wick assembly worked as predicted. The flint and wheel mechanism was reliable. Everything else was garbage. He threw away the Austrian casing and fabricated a new one, rectangular, sized to fit in the palm of a man's hand. The corners were rounded so the lighter wouldn't tear the lining of a trouser pocket. The metal was brass, which wouldn't rust and could be polished to a golden sheen. But the critical modification was the hinge.
Blaisdell soldered a short hinge to connect the lid permanently to the body. This seems like a minor detail. It wasn't. With the hinge, the entire operation of the lighter changed. You could flip open the lid with your thumb, strike the wheel with the same thumb, produce flame, and snap the lid closed to extinguish it, all with one hand. The transformation was complete. The Austrian lighter required a ritual. You had to stop, you had to use both hands, you had to focus on the device. The Zippo required nothing but a thumb. You could light it while walking, while holding a tool, while driving. It became an extension of the hand rather than a separate object demanding attention. The sound was accidental. The cam that held the lid closed created tension. When you released that tension, the brass lid struck the brass body with a distinctive metallic click. It wasn't designed for effect. It was a byproduct of the mechanism, but it became the lighter's signature. That click became a signal, readiness, intent, a small mechanical announcement that fire was about to appear. Blaisdell needed a name for his creation. He was drawn to another recent invention that had started appearing on American clothing, the zipper. The B.F. Goodrich Company had just started using the term to market rubber boots that closed with the new fastening system. The word was modern. It suggested speed and efficiency. He liked the sound of the word. It implied speed, closure, efficiency. He modified it to Zippo. It sounded active. It sounded like something that did a job quickly and well. The first Zippo lighter was produced in late 1932. It sold for $1.95. In 1932, that was not a trivial amount. It was the cost of several meals. It was what a laborer might make in half a day. A tank of gasoline for your car cost less than a Zippo. Blaisdell knew that if he was going to ask someone to spend that kind of money, he couldn't sell them a disposable novelty. He had to sell them something that would last. This is where the philosophy of the Zippo Manufacturing Company was forged. Most American companies in the 1930s were already experimenting with planned obsolescence, the idea that you could build a product designed to fail, forcing the customer to purchase a replacement, was becoming standard business practice. Light bulbs were engineered to burn out. Stockings were made to run. The economic logic was straightforward. Durability killed repeat business. Blaisdell went in the opposite direction. He issued a guarantee that was, by any conventional business analysis, insane. He promised that if a Zippo lighter ever failed to work for any reason, regardless of age or condition, the factory would repair it for free, forever. No time limit, no conditions, no fine print. If you sent a broken Zippo to Bradford, it would be fixed and returned to you at no charge. This wasn't a marketing slogan, it was a binding commitment. He wasn't selling a lighter. He was selling permanence in an impermanent time. He was selling the idea that in a world where everything was breaking down, the economy, the social order, the promise of progress, there could be one thing that would not fail you. The Zippo was heavy, heavier than it needed to be, really. The brass case had weight. When you put it in your pocket, you felt it there. It pulled at the fabric. You were aware of its presence. It smelled of naphtha fuel, a sharp petroleum scent that clung to your fingers. If you filled a Zippo in the morning, you could still smell it on your hands in the evening. The fuel evaporated slowly through the cotton batting, and over time you learned to recognize when it needed refilling just by the weight. It required maintenance. You had to trim the wick when it charred. You had to replace the flint when it wore down to a nub. You had to refill the cotton batting with fuel every few days if you used it regularly. This maintenance was part of the relationship. You didn't just own a Zippo. You maintained it. You knew its quirks. You developed a feel for when the flint was getting low, when the wick needed trimming. This was deliberate on Blaisdell's part. He understood that the maintenance created a bond. When you invest time in maintaining an object, you don't throw it away. You value it. You develop an attachment that goes beyond mere utility. The factory on Bolivar Street was small at first, a corner of a machine shop, second-hand equipment, a few workers. Production in those early years was limited, maybe a few dozen lighters per week. But the product worked. And in Bradford, in 1932, word spread when something actually worked. Local men started buying Zippos. Not many, because $1.95 was still a significant investment, but the ones who bought them told stories about lighting cigarettes in wind, about lighters that kept working year after year, about the guarantee. And slowly, the orders began to come from outside Bradford, from Pittsburgh, from Philadelphia, from distributors who wanted to stock them in hardware stores and tobacconists. By the late 1930s, the Zippo Manufacturing Company had moved to a larger facility on Barber Street. The building that still stands there today is an industrial structure typical of early 20th century American manufacturing. Brick, steel-framed windows, high ceilings to ventilate the heat from the machinery. It wasn't designed to be beautiful. It was designed to house the stamping presses, polishing wheels, and assembly lines that would produce millions of lighters. The architecture was purely functional. Thick brick walls to bear the weight of the equipment, large windows positioned to maximize natural light during the day, a sawtooth roofline on the newer sections to provide even illumination without glare, loading docks at ground level where raw materials could be delivered and finished products shipped out. Inside that building, the process was loud, industrial, and precise. Sheets of brass arrived from mills in the Midwest. The brass was an alloy of copper and zinc, typically 70% copper and 30% zinc. It wouldn't rust. It polished to a golden sheen, and it could be stamped into shape with enough force. The stamping presses were massive machines, multi-ton affairs that came down with enough pressure to punch the rectangular lighter cases out of flat brass sheet. The sound was constant, a rhythmic industrial thunder that you could hear blocks away. Each strike of the press produced one case. The scrap brass around the case was collected and sold back to the mills for remelting. After stamping, the cases moved to polishing. The polishing wheels spun at thousands of revolutions per minute, buffing the brass until it gleamed. The air in the polishing room was thick with brass dust, a fine golden powder that settled on everything. The workers wore masks, but still, at the end of a shift, they would cough up brass-colored phlegm. The hinges were soldered by hand. This required skill. The solder had to flow evenly without creating weak points. The hinge pin had to be inserted at exactly the right moment while the solder was still molten but cooling. Too early, and it wouldn't hold. Too late, and the solder would have hardened. Small pins held the cam mechanism together. The cam that created the distinctive click was installed with precision. Too tight, and the lid wouldn't open smoothly. Too loose, and it wouldn't stay closed. Each lighter was tested by hand before it left the factory. The cotton batting was inserted into the fuel chamber. The wick was threaded through the chimney. The flint wheel was installed and checked for smooth rotation.
By the time a Zippo left the Bradford factory, dozens of hands had touched it. It was an industrial product, yes, but it was also the result of specific human labor in a specific building in a specific town. George Blaisdell understood the importance of story. He wasn't content to just make a good product. He wanted people to know about it, to talk about it, to remember it. He commissioned a promotional vehicle, a Chrysler Saratoga with two enormous functional Zippo lighters mounted on the roof, complete with neon flames that lit up at night. He drove this vehicle across the country, parking it outside state fairs, hardware conventions, tobacco shops. It was absurd. It was memorable. It was effective. He placed advertisements in magazines showing rugged men using Zippos in impossible conditions, on fishing boats in storms, on construction sites in winter. The message was always the same: it works. But the story of the Zippo was about to be written by forces far larger than Blaisdell's promotional instincts. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the Second World War, and the entire infrastructure of American manufacturing was conscripted. Factories that had been making cars started making tanks. Textile mills that had been making clothing started making parachutes. The economy shifted overnight from civilian production to military production. The War Production Board was established to allocate resources. Brass, being an alloy of copper and zinc, was declared a strategic material. Copper was essential for artillery shell casings, electrical wiring in ships and aircraft, and bullet jackets. Zinc was needed for galvanizing steel to prevent rust on naval vessels. The civilian production of brass goods was halted by government order. For a company whose entire product was encased in brass, this should have been a death sentence. Blaisdell didn't close the factory. He didn't lay off his workers. He didn't sit and wait for the war to end. He pivoted. Steel was still available, though only low-grade steel that was unsuitable for weapons production. This steel had problems. It rusted easily. It pitted in humid air.
You couldn't polish it to a shine the way you could polish brass. The engineers at the Bradford factory developed a solution. They created a thick, porous black paint that was baked onto the steel at high temperatures. The paint formed a hard, textured skin. It wasn't attractive in the conventional sense, but it was durable. The texture helped the lighter stay in your grip even with wet or oily hands. They called it the black crackle finish. Then, Blaisdell made a decision that transformed the Zippo from a consumer product into a military artifact. He announced that the Zippo manufacturing company would cease all civilian sales for the duration of the war. Every Zippo produced in Bradford would be shipped directly to military post exchanges and supply depots. You could not buy a Zippo in a department store in New York or Chicago. You could not order one from a catalog. You could not walk into a tobacco shop and purchase one. The only way to get a Zippo was to be in the United States military. This created artificial scarcity in the civilian market and ubiquity in the military. It was a brilliant piece of strategic positioning. But more than that, it was a patriotic decision. Blaisdell saw the war as an existential crisis, and he directed every resource of his company towards supporting the men who were fighting it. For the millions of young men drafted into service, the Black Crackle Zippo became standard equipment. It wasn't officially issued like a rifle or a helmet, but it was sold at every post exchange for $1 or $2, and almost every soldier bought one. The relationship between the American soldier and the Zippo lighter was intimate. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, where the humidity rotted everything and rain fell in sheets that turned the ground to soup, the Zippo was often the only reliable source of fire. Matches disintegrated, other lighters clogged with moisture. The Zippo kept working. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, where temperatures dropped below zero and men's hands went numb inside their gloves, the Zippo could be operated with thick fingers. You didn't need fine motor control, just thumb pressure. In the North African desert, where sand infiltrated every piece of equipment, the Zippo's simple mechanism could be disassembled, cleaned, and reassembled in minutes. It became a multi-tool. Soldiers heated rations in their helmets using the flame. They sterilized knife blades for emergency medical procedures. They used the polished interior of the lid as a signal mirror to flash aircraft. They used the fuel to clean grease off their rifles. Some men carved notches into their Zippos, each notch representing a combat mission or a kill or a day survived. The lighter became a tally stick of experience. The windproof chimney, originally designed for a country club terrace in Pennsylvania, proved perfectly suited for the deck of a destroyer in a gale, or the open door of a C-47 transport plane at altitude, or a foxhole in a windswept field. Stories began to circulate, some verified, some embellished, but all contributing to a mythology. There was the documented case of a private in the Pacific Theater who took a bullet to the chest. The round struck the Zippo in his shirt pocket. The lighter was destroyed, the steel case mangled and fused by the impact of the lead, but the man lived. The deformed Zippo was sent back to Bradford, where it was put on display in the factory as evidence of the product's life-saving capability. Whether this happened once or a dozen times is difficult to verify from historical records, but the story circulated through the ranks. The Zippo became more than a tool. It became a talisman, a lucky charm. Men who didn't smoke still carried one. The black crackle finish, initially a wartime compromise, became a mark of service. As soldiers used their lighters, the black paint wore away at the corners and high points, revealing the steel underneath. Every lighter wore differently depending on how it was carried and used. If a man kept his Zippo in his front shirt pocket, the paint would wear off the top edges first. If he kept it in his trouser pocket, the bottom would show more wear. If he was left-handed, the wear pattern on the lid would be different than a right-handed man's. You could read a soldier's deployment in the wear pattern of his lighter. Fresh replacements had pristine black paint. Veterans who had been in theater for months had lighters where the steel showed through in complex patterns, like a map of their service. Back in Bradford, the factory ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts. The machines never stopped. The stamping presses thundered through the night. Blaisdell maintained his commitment to quality even under wartime production pressure. He understood that a lighter that failed in combat wasn't just an inconvenience. It could mean a soldier couldn't light the fuse on a demolition charge, couldn't signal his position, couldn't start a fire for warmth when hypothermia was setting in. The famous guarantee continued even during the war. If a soldier sent a broken Zippo back from the front, perhaps crushed by a trank tread, or dropped from a bomber, or damaged by shrapnel, the technicians in Bradford didn't simply send a replacement, they repaired the original. They hammered out dents, replaced broken hinges, re-welded cams, straightened lids. They understood that the specific lighter, with its specific scratches and wear, held meaning for the soldier who carried it. It had been with him through experiences that couldn't be shared with people back home. It had been in his pocket during his first combat, his first loss, his moments of terror and relief. To replace it with a new one would be to erase that history. So they fixed it, packaged it with a new flint and a small bottle of fluid, and mailed it back to the war. Sometimes these packages were sent to addresses in England or Australia, or forward operating bases in the Pacific. The company absorbed the shipping costs without question. By 1945, the Zippo had conquered the world. It was in the pockets of generals and privates alike. It had been carried onto the beaches of Normandy and the black sands of Iwo Jima. It had been in bombers over Germany and submarines in the Pacific. When the war ended and the troops came home, they brought their Zippos with them. The scarcity in the civilian market during the war years had created enormous pent-up demand. People wanted to buy Zippos and couldn't find them. But more significantly, an entire generation of American men had been imprinted with the device. They didn't want elegant table lighters or decorative Art Deco pieces. They wanted the box that clicked, the tool they had carried through the war. The black crackle finish was retired as brass became available again. The factory switched back to the golden metal. But the identity of the Zippo had been permanently altered by the war years. It was no longer just a lighter, it was a piece of American military history, a symbol of survival and reliability. The 1940s and 50s were the golden age of the Zippo as a cultural object. Companies began ordering them in bulk, engraved with corporate logos. It became a standard promotional item. If you worked for Ford or General Electric or U.S. Steel, you might receive a Zippo with the company name engraved on it as a service award or retirement gift. Military units commissioned custom designs. The 82nd Airborne had Zippos with paratrooper insignia. The Navy had them with ship names and hull numbers. Veterans organizations used them as membership tokens. Sports teams, labor unions, fraternal organizations. The Zippo became a canvas for American identity. You could read a man's affiliations by examining his lighter. Was he a union man or management? Ford or Chevrolet? Army or Navy? Mason or Elk? The lighter became what we might call today a social media profile, a portable declaration of identity and belonging. The factory in Bradford expanded. More stamping presses were installed, more workers were hired. The building grew with additions and annexes, each one slightly different in style, but connected to the main structure. By the 1950s, the Zippo Manufacturing Company employed hundreds of people in a town that desperately needed the jobs. Bradford's oil industry was effectively dead. The Zippo factory had become the economic anchor of the community. George Blaisdell walked those factory floors with pride. He had created something that mattered, an object that had proven itself in the worst conditions imaginable, a product that people trusted with their lives. He believed he had built something permanent, an American manufacturing company that would last for generations, a product that would remain essential because it did one thing perfectly and would never need to change. He didn't see what was coming. The enemy arrived in the 1970s in a shipping container from France. It was made of injection-molded plastic. It cost less than $1, and it represented a philosophy that was the exact opposite of everything the Zippo stood for. The Bic lighter was introduced to the American market in 1973 by the Bic Corporation, founded by Marcel Bic. Bic had already transformed the pen industry by replacing refillable fountain pens with disposable ballpoints. Now he applied the same principle to fire. The Bic lighter was a sealed unit. You couldn't open it. You couldn't refill it. It was filled with pressurized butane gas at the factory, and when the gas ran out, the lighter was dead. There was no wick to trim, no flint to replace, no fuel to pour, no maintenance required or even possible.
It had no weight. It was so light you could barely feel it in your pocket. It had no smell. The butane was odorless. It had no sound. When you struck it, there was just a quiet hiss as the gas ignited. And it cost 99 cents. The cultural shift this represented was profound. For decades, the Zippo had demanded a relationship with its user. You maintained it. You refilled it. You carried a small bottle of lighter fluid and a package of flints. This maintenance was the price of ownership, but it also created a bond. The Zippo was yours in a way that a disposable object could never be. But the generation that had survived the Depression and the war, the generation that saved aluminum foil and straightened bent nails and repaired torn clothing, was aging. Their children had grown up in post-war abundance. They had never known real scarcity. They didn't want to maintain things. They didn't want to carry lighter fluid. They didn't want objects that required care. They wanted convenience. They wanted instant. They wanted disposable. The sensory experience of fire changed completely. The Zippo was loud. The click of the lid was a mechanical announcement that could be heard across a room. The smell of naphtha was sharp and distinctive. If someone lit a Zippo nearby, you knew it. The flame was a ragged yellow dance, organic and alive, that struggled in wind but refused to die. The disposable lighter was silent. It hissed quietly, a sound you could barely hear. The smell was nothing. The butane burned clean. The flame was a perfect blue needle, steady and sterile. It appeared when you pressed the button and vanished the instant you released it. There was no personality, no character. It was fire that had been domesticated, tamed, reduced to pure utility without romance or danger. The Zippo Manufacturing Company looked at this plastic invasion with something approaching horror. How do you compete with a product whose implicit promise is that permanence is unnecessary? How do you sell a lifetime guarantee when your competitor's product is designed to be thrown away after 2 weeks? The management in Bradford tried to hold the line. They marketed the Zippo as a rugged outdoor tool, a masculine accessory in an increasingly convenience-oriented world, an heirloom you could pass down to your children. But the market share bled away month by month, year by year. Smokers, the primary users of lighters, defected in enormous numbers. Why carry a bottle of fluid and a pack of flints when you could just buy a Bic at any gas station for less than $1? When it died, you bought another one. No maintenance, no commitment, no relationship. The economics were brutal. A Zippo cost $6 or $5 by the 1970s. You had to buy fluid regularly. You had to replace flints. Over the lifetime of ownership, you might spend $20 or $30 maintaining a Zippo. Or you could buy disposable lighters for 99 cents and just throw them away when they died. For most people, the choice was obvious. In a move that felt like a betrayal of their own identity, Zippo attempted to produce butane lighters. They recognized that the market was moving away from liquid fuel. Butane didn't evaporate. It didn't smell. It produced a cleaner flame that left no soot on your cigar. They released the Zippo Contempo in the 1980s. It was a butane lighter manufactured in Japan, not Bradford. It was expensive, retailing for $15 or $20. It was complex, with multiple small parts that could fail. It looked somewhat like a Zippo, but felt wrong in the hand. It failed commercially. Zippo loyalists wouldn't buy it because it wasn't a real Zippo. It didn't have the windproof chimney. It didn't have the click. And people who wanted a butane lighter just bought a Bic because it was cheaper and simpler.